The outlaw ravages the town until his eyes meet the preacher's daughter, and he loves her at once. The sun hung merciless over Cedar Ridge, casting sharp shadows between the weathered buildings that lined the dusty main street. Heat shimmered off the wooden sidewalks where merchants swept sand from their doorsteps, the constant battle against the desert wind that carried grit into every crevice of their simple lives. Jake Cordell rode into town with the deliberate slowness of a man who owned every moment. His horse's hooves struck the packed earth in a steady rhythm, each step announcing his arrival to anyone with ears to hear. 3 years of robbing stagecoaches and running from lawmen had carved lines around his eyes, but they hadn't dimmed the dangerous intelligence that flickered there. The bank stood at the corner of Main and Church Streets, its brick facade promising security that Jake knew was nothing more than wishful thinking. He'd studied this town for weeks from the surrounding hills, watching the patterns of daily life unfold. The sheriff made his rounds at noon and again at sunset. The bank closed at 4. The stagecoach arrived every Tuesday with payroll for the mining company 20 miles north. It was Tuesday. Jake dismounted and tied his horse to the hitching post with movements that appeared casual but missed nothing. His fingers brushed the handle of his Colt, checking its position out of habit. The weight of it against his hip had become as familiar as his own heartbeat. The bank's interior felt cool after the blazing heat outside. Jake's boots echoed on the wooden floor as he approached the teller's window, his hand resting casually near his weapon. The clerk, a nervous man with wire spectacles, looked up with the practiced smile of someone accustomed to frontier politeness. "Good afternoon, sir. How might I help you?" Jake's response came swift and quiet. "Empty the till. Don't make any sudden moves and nobody gets hurt." The teller's face drained of color, but his hands moved to comply. Jake had learned that quiet authority worked better than shouting and threats. The money disappeared into his saddlebags with practiced efficiency, and he was back on the street within minutes. That was when he saw her. She stood on the church steps across the street, her dark hair catching the afternoon light like spun copper. The simple blue dress she wore couldn't hide the graceful way she moved as she swept the wooden steps clean of sand and debris. There was something about the careful attention she paid to her task that made Jake's chest tighten in a way he couldn't name. When she looked up, their eyes met across the dusty expanse of Main Street. Jake had expected to see fear when word of the robbery spread, but her gaze held something else entirely, curiosity perhaps, or recognition of something in him that he'd forgotten existed. For a moment that stretched longer than the space between heartbeats, neither moved. Then she turned and disappeared through the church doors, leaving Jake staring at empty wooden steps. The sound of approaching horses snapped him back to the present. He swung into his saddle and spurred his mount toward the edge of town, but something made him glance back one final time. She stood in the church window now, watching him ride away with an expression he couldn't read. 2 miles outside Cedar Ridge, Jake pulled up near a cluster of cottonwood trees. His horse needed water, and he needed to think. The robbery had gone perfectly, but the memory of those eyes lingered like smoke from a campfire that wouldn't quite disperse. He'd never been one to dwell on the faces of strangers, but something about the preacher's daughter, for that's what she had to be, had lodged itself in his mind like a splinter. The way she'd looked at him hadn't carried the usual mixture of fear and fascination. Instead, there had been something deeper, more unsettling. Recognition, as if she'd seen straight through the outlaw exterior to whatever remained of the man underneath. Jake made camp that evening in a hidden canyon he'd discovered weeks earlier. As he built a small fire and prepared his simple meal, his thoughts kept drifting back to Cedar Ridge, to her. This was foolishness. He had money now, enough to disappear into Mexico where his face wasn't on wanted posters. The smart thing would be to ride hard and put distance between himself and this place. Instead, he found himself planning to return. 3 days later, Jake rode back towards Cedar Ridge. He told himself it was just to gather information, to make sure the law hadn't picked up his trail. But as he approached the town from the west, staying hidden in the scrub brush and rocky outcroppings, he knew he was lying to himself. She was in the church garden when he finally caught sight of her, kneeling among rows of vegetables that somehow flourished despite the harsh climate. Her hands moved gently among the plants, checking for signs of disease with the same careful attention she'd given to sweeping the steps. He was preparing to leave when she looked up, directly at his hiding place among the rocks. "You can come out," she said, her voice carrying clearly in the still morning air. "I know you're there." Jake's hand moved instinctively to his gun, but something in her tone stopped him from drawing it. After a long moment, he emerged from concealment and walked slowly toward the garden. She remained kneeling among her plants, watching his approach with those same calm eyes that had unsettled him days before. "You came back," she said, when he was close enough for normal conversation. "Seems I did." Jake kept his hands visible and his voice level. "You don't seem surprised." "I'm not." She stood and brushed dirt from her skirts, movements unhurried despite having a known outlaw standing 6 feet away. "I've been wondering when you would. Most folks would be scared. Most folks haven't spent their lives listening to their father preach about redemption and second chances." She met his eyes steadily. "I'm Evangeline Hayes. I know who you are. And I know who you are, Jake Cordell." Her voice held no accusation, only a strange sort of gentleness. "The question is whether you know who you could be." They stood in silence for a moment, surrounded by the growing things she tended with such care. Jake had never been good with words that weren't threats or demands. "Why aren't you afraid of me?" he finally asked. "Should I be?" "Most people think so. Most people haven't looked in your eyes." She tilted her head slightly, studying his face. "There's pain there, but not cruelty. Desperation, but not evil. What happened to make you choose this path?" The question hit harder than any fist Jake had ever taken. No one had asked him that in 3 years. "That's not a story for someone like you," he said finally. "Someone like me. Good, pure, the kind of person who sees the best in things." Evangeline's laugh was soft, but carried a note of sadness. "You think goodness means ignorance? My father tends a flock that includes drunks, gamblers, men who've killed other men. Goodness isn't about avoiding darkness, Mr. Cordell. It's about choosing to carry light into it." Jake stared at her, this slip of a woman who spoke of darkness and light, as if she understood both intimately. Something in her words resonated with a part of himself he'd thought long dead. "The law's looking for me," he said. "I know. There's a price on my head. I know that too. Then why are you talking to me instead of screaming for the sheriff?" Evangeline was quiet for a moment, her gaze drifting to the church behind them. When she looked back at Jake, something had shifted in her expression. "Because 3 days ago, you robbed our bank and could have hurt people, but you chose not to. Because when you looked at me across that street, I saw something in your eyes that I recognize." She paused. "I see the same thing in my mirror sometimes. The look of someone who's lost their way, but hasn't given up hope of finding it again." Her words hung in the air between them like morning mist, fragile and beautiful. Jake felt something crack open in his chest, a door he'd welded shut 3 years ago when his brother died in his arms, and the law blamed Jake for crimes he hadn't committed. "I should go," he said, but he didn't move. "You should," she agreed, "but you won't, not yet." She was right, and they both knew it. Something had passed between them that neither could walk away from easily. "What are you growing here?" he asked, nodding toward the garden. "Things that can survive in hard ground," she said. "Beans, squash, herbs for healing. My father says it's a waste of effort, that the desert always wins in the end. But I've found that with enough care and patience, almost anything can take root and flourish, even in the harshest places." Jake heard the metaphor in her words. He knelt and examined the plants more closely, noting the careful placement of stones to create shade, the clever irrigation system that conserved every drop of precious water. "You've thought this through," he observed. "Everything worth doing requires thought and planning." She knelt beside him, close enough that he could smell the clean scent of soap and sunshine in her hair, and faith that the effort will be rewarded. "What if it isn't? What if the desert wins? Then at least I'll know I tried." She touched one of the bean plants gently. "And maybe the next person who tries will benefit from what I learned." If this story has touched your heart so far, don't forget to subscribe to the channel, like the video, and share it with friends who love Old West stories. They worked in the garden together for an hour, Jake following her lead as she showed him how to identify signs of plant health, how to encourage growth without forcing it. Her hands moved with practiced confidence, and he found himself watching them more than the plants. "You're a natural teacher," he said, when they finally sat back to survey their work. "I learned from my father. He says the best sermons aren't preached from the pulpit, but lived out in daily choices." She looked at him sideways. "Though I suspect you didn't come here for gardening lessons." "I'm not sure why I came." "Yes, you are." Her voice was gentle but certain. "You came because you're tired of running, tired of being alone with your pain. You came because you saw something in me that reminded you of who you used to be." Jake felt exposed under her steady gaze. "You don't know anything about who I used to be. Tell me." The simple request hit him like a physical blow. Nobody had asked him to tell his story, not the real one, not since his brother died. It's not a pretty story. The best ones rarely are. Jake studied her face, looking for signs of false piety, but found only genuine interest and compassion. After a long moment, he began to speak. "I had a brother, Samuel. He was younger than me, but smarter, had plans to study law back east. He believed in justice, in the idea that good men could make the world better." Jake's voice caught slightly. "I believed in it too back then." Evangeline didn't interrupt, didn't offer empty words of comfort. She simply listened, and somehow that made it easier to continue. "We had a small ranch outside Tucson. Samuel was going to sell his half to pay for school. Then the Jameson gang hit the bank in town, killed 2 people. When the sheriff formed a posse, Samuel and I both rode with them." "That was the right thing to do, was it?" Jake's laugh held no humor. "We tracked them to an abandoned mine. They'd holed up there, well armed and ready for a siege. Samuel suggested we try talking to them first, said maybe we could convince them to surrender, avoid more bloodshed." Jake's hands clenched into fists. "I should have stopped him, but he was my little brother and he'd always been the smart one, so I let him try." "What happened?" "They shot him the moment he stepped into view. Gut shot so he'd die slow. He lived for 3 hours, died in my arms, asking me to forgive them." Evangeline's sharp intake of breath was the only sound in the garden. When Jake finally looked up, he saw tears in her eyes. "The posse went in shooting after that. Killed all 4 of them. But when we got back to town, stories started changing. Some said Samuel had been trying to warn the gang, that we'd been working with them all along." His voice turned bitter. "Amazing how quickly good men will turn on you when they need someone to blame. They didn't believe your version of events. The sheriff who'd asked us to join the posse suddenly decided we'd been acting suspicious. Within a week I had a choice: stand trial for crimes I didn't commit, or disappear into the desert. So you became what they accused you of being. Seemed easier than fighting a battle I couldn't win." Jake met her eyes. 3 years later, I'm exactly what they said I was, a bank robber, an outlaw." They sat in silence for several minutes. Jake waited for her to make excuses and leave. Instead, she reached out and touched his hand briefly. "You still have something to lose," she said quietly. "What's that?" "The part of yourself that rode with that posse because it was right. The part that grieves for your brother. The part that chose not to hurt anyone when you robbed our bank." She squeezed his fingers gently. "That part of you is still alive, Jake Cordell. Wounded and buried, but alive." Jake stared at their joined hands. amazed that someone could touch him without flinching. "Why do you care?" he asked. "Because my father taught me that grace isn't earned, it's given freely, because I believe in second chances." She smiled. "And because when you looked at me across that street, I saw the man you could be again if you chose to be him." The law won't see it that way. Perhaps not all of them, but some will. And that doesn't change who you choose to be moving forward. Jake wanted to believe her, wanted to trust in the possibility she offered, but 3 years of running had taught him that hope was a luxury he couldn't afford. "I should go," he said, though he made no move to rise. "My reputation can survive associating with someone who needs help." Her voice carried quiet steel. "The question is whether you're ready to stop running long enough to accept it." Before Jake could respond, the sound of approaching hoofbeats interrupted them. Evangeline glanced toward the front of the church. "Sheriff's making his afternoon rounds," she said. "You should—" "Miss Hayes," the voice called from around the corner. "Everything all right back there?" Jake was already moving, sliding behind a tool shed. Evangeline rose gracefully and brushed dirt from her skirts as the sheriff appeared, a middle-aged man with kind eyes. "Good afternoon, Sheriff Martinez," she said with calm composure. "Just tending the garden. Thought I heard voices. Just talking to myself. Bad habit I picked up from my father." Her smile was guileless. "How is Mrs. Martinez feeling?" The sheriff's face softened. "Better, thanks for asking. That tea you brought her helped considerable." He glanced around the garden. "You be careful working out here alone. Had reports of a stranger in the area. Might be that outlaw who hit the bank last week." "I'll be careful, Sheriff. Thank you for the warning." After the lawman left, Jake emerged from hiding, shaken by how close he'd come to discovery and by Evangeline's smooth protection of him. "Why did you do that?" he asked. "Because you haven't done anything to hurt me or anyone else since you've been here. Because everyone deserves a chance to choose differently." She moved closer. "And because I believe you're a better man than your reputation suggests. You barely know me. I know enough." Her voice held absolute certainty. "I know you came back when you could have ridden away. I know you listened to talk about redemption without laughing. I know you're gentle with growing things and grieved for a brother who believed in justice." Jake found himself leaning toward her, drawn by her certainty. "What if you're wrong about me? Then I'll have been wrong about someone worth the risk." Her smile held no fear. "But I don't think I am. Meet me tomorrow evening," he heard himself say. "After sunset by the old mine north of town. If you're serious about believing in second chances, we need to talk away from curious eyes." "I'll be there." He turned to go, then paused. "If you change your mind, don't come. I won't think less of you for it." "I'll be there," she repeated. That night, Jake lay awake staring at stars that seemed brighter than they had in years, thinking about gardens that bloomed in desert soil and voices that spoke of redemption. For the first time since Samuel's death, Jake Ordell allowed himself to imagine a future that didn't involve running. Evangeline arrived exactly at sunset, riding a gentle mare with confidence. She'd changed into riding clothes and carried a small basket that suggested she'd planned for a longer conversation. "You came," Jake said, emerging from the rocks where he'd been watching. "I said I would." She dismounted and tethered her horse. "Did you doubt me? I've learned to doubt most everything. That must be exhausting." She retrieved her basket and looked around with interest rather than fear. "This is where it happened, where your brother died." "Yes." "It feels sad," she said simply. "Like a place where hope came to die." "That's one way to put it." Evangeline walked closer to the mine entrance. "But sadness isn't permanent, any more than hope is. Both are just stopping places on a longer journey." "And what journey is that? Toward becoming who we're meant to be." She opened her basket and withdrew bread, cheese, and fruit. "I've been thinking about what you told me yesterday, about your brother and the choices you made after his death." Jake tensed, expecting judgment. Instead, she gestured for him to sit on a flat boulder. "I think Samuel would be proud of you," she continued. proud? Jake nearly choked on the word. I'm everything he stood against. Have you? You've stolen money, yes, but have you become cruel? Have you abandoned every principle he taught you? Her voice remained steady. Or have you simply made the hard choice to survive in a world that judged you before it knew you? Those are pretty words, but they don't change what I've done. No, they don't, but they might change what you do next. She broke off a piece of bread. Tell me about him. About Samuel before everything went wrong. For the next hour, as the sun set and painted the sky gold and crimson, Jake found himself talking about his brother in ways he hadn't allowed himself to remember. Samuel's laugh, his terrible jokes, the way he'd read law books by candlelight and dream about the changes he'd make. The stories came haltingly at first, then in a rush, as 3 years of suppressed grief finally found an outlet. He sounds wonderful, Evangeline said when Jake finally fell silent. He was. Too good for this world, maybe. Or exactly what this world needed. She gathered the remains of their meal. Jake, what if I told you there was a way to honor his memory without dying for it? I'd say you're dreaming. Maybe I am. But consider this. What if instead of running from your past, you faced it? What if instead of letting their lies define you, you chose to live the truth Samuel believed in? The law won't just forget about me because I decide to change. No, but there are ways to make amends, ways to prove that you're not the man they claim you are. She leaned forward. My father has connections throughout the territory. Judges who believe in mercy, lawmen who value justice over vengeance. It wouldn't be easy, but what? I turn myself in and hope for the best. You trust something better than the system. Her voice dropped to barely above a whisper. You trust the God who gives second chances to anyone willing to take them. Jake stared at her. This extraordinary woman who spoke of God and justice as if they were personally acquainted. I'm not sure I believe in God anymore. That's all right. He still believes in you. Evangeline's smile was gentle but unshakable, and so do I. What are you asking me to do? Come back with me. Not to turn yourself in, but to start rebuilding the life you should have had. Help in the church, work with your hands, show this community that you're not the monster they've been told to fear. She paused. Let me help you find your way home. Home. The word resonated in Jake's chest like a bell struck in an empty cathedral. He'd been homeless for 3 years, not just in terms of having no fixed address, but in the deeper sense of having no place where he belonged. It's too dangerous, he said. But even as the words left his mouth, he knew he was wavering. For whom? For me? Evangeline shook her head. I've made my choice. I'd rather live one day helping someone find redemption than a lifetime playing it safe. Jake looked out over the valley where Cedar Ridge nestled among the hills, its windows glowing like earthbound stars. Somewhere down there was the church where Evangeline's father preached about mercy, the garden where she tended growing things, the community that might be willing to see him as something other than an outlaw. If I do this, he said slowly, if I try to come back from what I've become, you need to understand that it won't be easy. There'll be people who want me gone or dead. I know. And if the law comes for me, I won't let them take me without a fight. I wouldn't expect you to, her voice remained steady, but until that day comes, if it comes, we'll live with hope instead of fear. Jake studied her face one final time, looking for any sign of doubt. Finding none, he made the choice that would change both their lives forever. All right, he said, I'll try. Evangeline's smile could have lit the entire valley. Without hesitation, she reached out and took his hand. Then let's go home, she said. They rode back to Cedar Ridge together, under a canopy of stars, two unlikely souls, bound by faith in possibilities that existed only in the space between heartbeats. Jake had no idea what the morning would bring, but for the first time since Samuel's death, he wasn't afraid to find out. The next few weeks passed in suspended time, as if the entire world had agreed to hold its breath while Jake learned to be human again. Evangeline introduced him to her father as a drifter looking for honest work, and Reverend Hayes offered Jake room and board in exchange for repairs around the church property. The work felt good under his hands, mending broken boards, fixing a leaking roof, replacing rotted fence posts. Simple tasks that required skill but not violence, that built rather than destroyed. Jake had forgotten the satisfaction of creation. The townspeople's reactions ranged from wary acceptance to outright suspicion. Some seemed willing to judge him by his current actions rather than whatever rumors might have reached their ears. Others watched him with the careful attention of people who expected trouble. Sheriff Martinez fell somewhere in between, neither welcoming nor hostile, but clearly aware that there was more to Jake's story than met the eye. He made a point of checking on the church regularly, always polite but obviously alert. "Man's got a right to make a fresh start," the sheriff said one afternoon as he watched Jake repair the church bell tower. "Long as he's not bringing his old troubles with him." "No troubles here, Sheriff," Jake replied, keeping his voice level. "Good to hear. This is a peaceful town, and we aim to keep it that way." It was Evangeline who helped him navigate the delicate social balance, coaching him on which people to approach and which to avoid. She seemed to understand instinctively how to present him as someone worthy of cautious acceptance. "Mrs. Patterson asked about your family," she mentioned one evening as they worked in the garden. "I told her you'd lost touch with your relatives back east and were looking to start over out here. Close enough to the truth," Jake observed, carefully transplanting seedlings. "The best lies always are." Evangeline's tone was matter-of-fact. "People need a story they can understand." Jake paused to study her face. "You're more pragmatic than I expected from a preacher's daughter. Growing up in frontier towns teaches you that survival sometimes requires compromise. The trick is knowing which principles you bend and which you never break." She met his eyes. "I've never broken the important ones." "And what are those?" "Protect the innocent. Help those who need it. Never stop believing that people can change." Her voice softened. "Love without conditions." The last words hung in the air between them, weighted with meaning that neither was quite ready to acknowledge aloud. "Speaking of change," Jake said, "I've been thinking about what comes next. I can't stay here indefinitely just fixing church property. What did you have in mind?" "There's talk in town about needing a new deputy sheriff, someone to help patrol the outer settlements." Jake kept his voice casual. "Might be a way to use my particular skills for something constructive." Evangeline's hands stilled among the plants. "That would put you directly in contact with lawmen from other towns. Someone might recognize you." "It's a risk," Jake admitted, "but it's also the fastest way to prove I'm not the same man who robbed banks. I can't hide forever. I'd rather meet my past head-on as the man I'm choosing to be now." She was quiet for a long moment. When she finally spoke, her voice carried both pride and worry. "You're right, of course. I've grown accustomed to having you here, to feeling like we're building something together. We are building something. But it needs to be built on truth, not just careful lies." And over the following days, Jake began making discreet inquiries about the deputy position. Sheriff Martinez received Jake's application with raised eyebrows, but no immediate rejection. "You've got the look of a man who's seen trouble," he said, studying Jake across his desk. "Question is whether you were running from it or toward it." "Both, at different times," Jake answered honestly. "But I'm tired of running. I'll need references, people who can vouch for your character." Jake named Reverend Hayes and 2 townspeople he'd done odd jobs for. Martinez made notes, his expression unreadable. "I'll check with these folks and get back to you," he said finally. "Fair warning, though. This job puts you in contact with lawmen from across the territory. If you've got warrants or outstanding business with the law, better to tell me now." The moment of truth. Jake could feel his future balanced on the edge of his next words. "Nothing that should interfere with the job," he said carefully. Martinez studied him for another long moment, then nodded. "Give me a week to check your references." Walking back to the church, Jake felt the weight of the gamble he'd just made. If Martinez dug too deep, everything could unravel. But if he didn't, if Jake's month of quiet good behavior had been enough... "How did it go?" Evangeline asked when he found her in the church kitchen. "Hard to tell. He's checking references." "That's good. It means he's considering you seriously. If I get this job, if I manage to build a legitimate life here, there's something I want you to know." The words came haltingly. "These past weeks, working beside you, being part of something good, it's been the closest thing to happiness I've felt since Samuel died." Evangeline's eyes filled with tears, but her smile was radiant. "Jake, I know I'm not much of a prospect. Ex-outlaw with a bounty on his head, no property, no guarantees. But if this works out, I'd like to, that is, I hope you might consider..." She crossed the distance between them and silenced him with a kiss. It was Jake's first kiss in 3 years, and it tasted like hope and home and possibilities he'd thought lost forever. When they separated, he rested his forehead against hers. "Is that a yes?" he asked softly. "That's a yes to whatever question you were trying to ask," she whispered back. The week that followed seemed to last forever. Jake continued his work around the church, but every appearance of the sheriff made his pulse race. Evangeline maintained her usual calm exterior, but he caught her watching him with worried eyes. On Friday afternoon, Sheriff Martinez appeared at the church door just as Jake was finishing repairs to the front steps. The lawman's expression gave nothing away. "Walk with me," Martinez said simply. They strolled down Main Street in silence. Past the bank Jake had robbed what felt like a lifetime ago. Jake kept his hands relaxed, but every muscle was coiled for action. "Talk to your references," Martinez said finally. "Reverend Hayes speaks very highly of you, says you're reliable, hardworking, and have a strong moral compass." Jake said nothing, waiting. "Mrs. Chen at the laundry says you helped her move those heavy washtubs without being asked. Old Pete claims you know your way around horses better than most cowboys." They paused at the edge of town, where the desert stretched toward distant mountains. Martinez pulled out a deputy's badge and turned it over in his weathered hands. "Thing is," he continued, "I also sent some telegrams, asked around about drifters matching your description." He looked up at Jake with sharp eyes. "Interesting responses I got." Jake's mouth went dry. This was it then. "Seems there's a wanted man operating in the territory. Jake Cordell, bank robber, dangerous. Description matches you pretty well." Martinez paused. "But here's the curious thing. Every lawman I talk to says this Cordell fellow is a cold killer. Shoots first, never shows mercy, travels alone." Jake waited, hardly daring to breathe. "Now, I've been watching you for a month," Martinez continued, "and I've seen a man who goes out of his way to avoid confrontation, who helps old ladies with heavy bundles and fixes church steps without complaint, who looks at the preacher's daughter like she hung the moon and stars." The sheriff's smile was slight but genuine. "Either you're the best actor I've ever met, or you're not the same man those wanted posters describe. What are you saying?" "I'm saying that people change, sometimes for the worse, but occasionally for the better. I'm saying that a man's actions matter more than his reputation." Martinez held out the badge. "Job's yours if you want it. Deputy Sheriff, Cedar Ridge and surrounding territory. You'll answer to me, but you'll have authority to keep the peace as you see fit." Jake stared at the badge, as if it might bite him. "You know who I am. I know who you were. Question is, who do you want to be moving forward?" Slowly, Jake reached out and took the badge. The metal felt warm in his palm, weighty with responsibility and possibility. "I want to be the man Evangeline sees when she looks at me," he said quietly. "Good answer." Martinez clapped him on the shoulder. "Welcome to the force, Deputy Cordell." As they walked back toward town, Jake pinned the badge to his shirt with hands that shook slightly. The irony was almost overwhelming. Jake Cordell, wanted outlaw, had just been sworn in to uphold the very laws he'd spent 3 years breaking. One more thing, Martinez said. There are still men out there looking for the Jake Cordell from the wanted posters, men who won't be as interested in redemption stories as I am. I understand. Jake found Evangeline in the garden, as he'd known he would. She looked up from her work, then saw the badge on his shirt. Her smile could have outshone the sun. Deputy Sheriff Cordell, she said, testing out the words. It has a nice sound to it. Sheriff Martinez knows, Jake said quietly, about who I used to be. He hired me anyway. What changed his mind? He said actions matter more than reputation, that people can change for the better. Jake touched the badge uncertainly. I hope he's right. He is. Her voice carried absolute certainty. And now you have the chance to prove it. That evening, Reverend Hayes blessed Jake's new position with a prayer that spoke of second chances and divine grace. Later, as he and Evangeline sat on the church steps watching the stars emerge, she leaned against his shoulder. What are you thinking about? She asked softly. Samuel, wondering what he'd think of all this. I think he'd be proud, his brother wearing a badge instead of running from one. Jake considered this, imagining his brother's reaction. He always said the best way to honor the dead was to live fully, to choose hope over fear, love over hate. Wise man, your brother. He was. Jake's voice caught. I just wish he could have lived to see this. Maybe he can, Evangeline said gently. Maybe love doesn't end with death. They sat in comfortable silence, Jake's arm around Evangeline's shoulders, both contemplating futures that had seemed impossible months before. Jake, Evangeline said eventually. Earlier in the kitchen, you were trying to ask me something. Jake's heart began to race again. I believe the proper form involves getting down on one knee. He turned to look at her, seeing mischief and love in her eyes. Are you proposing to me, Miss Hayes? I'm suggesting that if you're going to do it, you might as well do it properly. Jake stood and helped her to her feet, then dropped to one knee on the church steps where they'd shared so many conversations about redemption and second chances. Evangeline Hayes, he said, looking up into her face that was luminous in the starlight, you saved my life in every way a person can be saved. You saw something worth loving when I couldn't see anything worth preserving. He took her hands in his. I don't have much to offer, a deputy's salary, a history that's complicated and no guarantees. But I can promise you this, I will love you with everything I have for as long as I draw breath. Will you marry me? Yes, she said simply, then louder. Yes, Jake Cordell, I will marry you. He stood and swept her into his arms, spinning her around on the church steps while she laughed with pure joy. When he finally set her down, they kissed again, sealing a promise that had been building between them since the moment their eyes first met across a dusty street. They planned the wedding for the following month. The work as deputy sheriff proved challenging but rewarding, mediating disputes between ranchers, escorting supply wagons, investigating reports of cattle rustling. Jake discovered that his years as an outlaw had given him unique insights into criminal thinking that proved valuable in law enforcement. More importantly, his own experience with redemption made him patient with people who'd made mistakes. Instead of simply arresting every petty criminal, he tried to understand their circumstances and find solutions that addressed underlying problems. You've got a gift for this work, Sheriff Martinez observed one evening. Most lawmen see things in simple terms, good guys and bad guys. You understand that most people are somewhere in between. Takes one to know one, I guess, Jake replied with a rueful smile. 2 weeks before the wedding, Jake's past caught up with him in the form of 2 bounty hunters who rode into Cedar Ridge, asking questions about a man matching his description. They were professionals with calculating eyes of predators who'd found fresh sign. 2 men at the saloon asking about you, Martinez warned quietly. Bounty hunters. They've got wanted posters, and they're offering money for information. Jake's blood ran cold. How much do they know? enough to be dangerous. They know someone matching Jake Cordell's description has been seen in the area. What do you recommend? Martinez was quiet for a long moment. Officially, I should probably turn you over to them. Unofficially, I've seen the man you've become. The Jake Cordell those bounty hunters are looking for doesn't exist anymore. That won't matter much to a federal judge. Maybe not, but it matters to this town, and it matters to me. Martinez adjusted his badge. Those men are strangers here. Easy for strangers to get confused, make mistakes in their investigations. Jake understood what the sheriff was offering, protection at considerable risk to his own career. I can't ask you to lie for me. You're not asking. I'm offering. Martinez's smile was grim but determined. Besides, those bounty hunters are looking for a dangerous outlaw who travels alone. Deputy Sheriff Jake Cordell is a respected member of this community, engaged to the preacher's daughter. Clearly two different men. The next morning brought a development that changed everything. Jake was reviewing patrol schedules when a commotion outside drew his attention. Through the window, he saw the bounty hunters on horseback, but they weren't alone. Between them, hands tied and looking worse for wear, sat a third man. Sheriff Martinez emerged from the crowd and approached the riders. Found him holed up in an abandoned mine, one bounty hunter announced loudly. Jake Cordell, wanted for bank robbery, matches the description perfectly. Jake's blood froze as he got a clear look at the prisoner's face. The man was roughly his height and build, with similar coloring, but it wasn't Jake Cordell. It was someone else entirely, a stranger who'd apparently been in the wrong place at the wrong time. This is a mistake, the prisoner was saying desperately. My name's Tom Wilson. I work cattle for the Bar T Ranch. Save it for the judge, the bounty hunter cut him off. Jake watched in horror as his own nightmare played out with a different victim. This was what would have happened to him 3 years ago if he'd stayed, arrested on circumstantial evidence, condemned by a system more interested in finding someone to blame than discovering truth. He couldn't let it happen. Jake stepped out of the sheriff's office, his hand resting casually on his gun. Martinez caught his eye and gave an almost imperceptible shake of his head, a warning to stay out of it. But Jake had learned something important over the past months. Some things mattered more than safety. Gentlemen, he said, stepping forward with measured authority, I'm Deputy Sheriff Cordell. Seems like you've got some business in our town. The first bounty hunter looked Jake over dismissively. Official business. We're transporting a wanted fugitive. Mind if I see your paperwork? The man produced a folded wanted poster, handing it over with obvious reluctance. Jake unfolded the paper, seeing his own face staring back at him. Interesting, Jake said calmly, though his heart was pounding. This poster describes a man who has a scar on his left hand from a knife fight. He looked at the bound prisoner. Mind showing me your hands, mister? Wilson, the man said eagerly. Tom Wilson, and I ain't got no scars. The prisoner held up both hands, showing calluses from ranch work, but no knife scars. Jake nodded and turned back to the bounty hunters. Poster also says this Jake Cordell is known for his skill with firearms. You test this man's shooting ability? Don't need to, the second bounty hunter said impatiently. Description matches close enough. Close enough isn't good enough when a man's life is at stake. Jake's voice carried authority. Sheriff Martinez, I think we need to investigate these charges more thoroughly. Martinez stepped forward, understanding Jake's intent. Deputy Cordell's right, he said firmly. We don't just hand over citizens without proper verification. Mr. Wilson, you say you work for the Bar T Ranch? Yes, sir, 3 years now. You can wire Boss Patterson, he'll vouch for me. We'll do that. Martinez faced the bounty hunters with polite but implacable authority. Gentlemen, I'm going to have to ask you to wait while we verify this man's identity. The first bounty hunter's face darkened. This is interference with official business. This is proper law enforcement procedure, Jake said quietly. For a tense moment, the situation balanced on a knife's edge. Then Martinez stepped forward with calm authority. "Here's what's going to happen," he announced. "Mr. Wilson is going to be held in our jail while we verify his identity properly. Anyone who's got a problem with that can take it up with the territorial marshal." The bounty hunters exchanged glances, clearly frustrated but recognizing they were outnumbered. After a long moment, the first one spat into the dust. "Fine, but when this proves to be your man, we expect full cooperation." "Of course," Martinez agreed. "That's how the law works." That evening, Jake sat with Evangeline on the church steps, watching the sun set over the desert hills. The events of the day had left him drained but strangely peaceful. Tom Wilson's boss confirmed his identity, he told her. "Wire came through an hour ago. Bounty hunters had to release him. And now they're looking for the real Jake Cordell again. Now they're looking for a ghost." Jake's voice held quiet satisfaction. "The man they're hunting doesn't exist anymore. He died the day you looked across that street and saw something worth saving. What you did today, protecting that innocent man, that's who you really are. It could have cost us everything, but it didn't, because you're not the same person they're looking for." She turned to study his face. "When you stepped forward to defend Tom Wilson, you were thinking about what was right." Jake considered this, remembering the moment when he'd made the choice to act. She was correct. All his calculations about risk had fallen away in the face of a simpler imperative. An innocent man was in danger, and he had the power to help. "Samuel would have done the same thing," he said quietly. "Yes, he would have, and that's how I know you found your way back to who you were always meant to be." The bounty hunters left Cedar Ridge the next morning, their wagon empty and their mood sour. Jake watched them ride away, feeling a weight lift from his shoulders that he'd carried for 3 long years. They would keep looking for Jake Cordell, the outlaw, but they wouldn't find him because he no longer existed. The wedding took place on a Sunday morning in October, when the desert air had turned crisp and the cottonwood trees showed touches of gold. The entire town turned out, filling the small church to capacity. Reverend Hayes performed the ceremony with obvious joy, speaking about love's power to transform lives and create new beginnings. Jake stood at the altar in his best suit, the deputy's badge pinned proudly to his lapel, and watched Evangeline walk down the aisle in her simple but elegant dress. When she reached his side and took his hand, Jake felt the last pieces of his broken life click into place. "Do you, Jacob Cordell, take this woman to be your lawfully wedded wife, to have and to hold in sickness and in health for better or worse, as long as you both shall live?" "I do," Jake said, his voice carrying clearly through the packed church. "Do you, Evangeline Hayes, take this man to be your lawfully wedded husband, to have and to hold in sickness and in health, for better or worse, as long as you both shall live?" "I do," she replied, squeezing his hands gently. "Then by the power vested in me, I pronounce you husband and wife. You may kiss your bride." Jake leaned down and kissed his wife while the congregation erupted in applause. When they separated, both were laughing and crying simultaneously, overwhelmed by the journey that had brought them here. The celebration lasted well into the evening, with music and dancing in the churchyard, tables groaning under food contributed by the community, and toasts that grew increasingly creative. Jake found himself surrounded by people who genuinely cared about his happiness, who had accepted him, not despite his past, but because of the man he'd proven himself to be. As the evening wound down, Jake and Evangeline walked hand in hand to their new home, a small house behind the church that the congregation had helped them prepare as a wedding gift. "Mrs. Cordell," Jake said as they stood on their front porch, testing out the sound of her new name. "Deputy Cordell," she replied with mock formality, then dissolved into giggles. "We're really married." "We really are." Jake pulled her close, marveling at the simple miracle of having someone to come home to. "Any regrets?" "Only one." Jake's heart skipped. "What's that?" "I regret that we waited so long to do this." Evangeline's smile was mischievous and loving. "I knew from that first day in the garden that this was how our story was meant to end." "And I thought this was just the beginning. You're right. She stood on her toes to kiss him softly. The beginning of the rest of our lives. 6 months later, Jake was making his morning rounds when a familiar figure rode into Cedar Ridge. The man was older, wearing the badge of a U.S. Marshal, with the kind of weathered face that suggested he'd seen every variation of human nature. "Morning," Jake said, as the Marshal dismounted. "Something I can help you with. Looking for Sheriff Martinez. Name's David Hawthorne, U.S. Marshal out of Phoenix." The handshake was firm but not aggressive. "Got some questions about a wanted fugitive." Jake's blood chilled, but he kept his expression neutral. "Sheriff's making rounds. Should be back within the hour. You're welcome to wait in the office." "Much obliged." Hawthorne settled into a chair with patient air. "You're the deputy, I take it?" "Jake Cordell." "Cordell." Hawthorne repeated the name thoughtfully, then pulled out a wanted poster. "Interesting coincidence. I'm looking for a man by that same name." The moment Jake had been dreading had finally arrived. He looked down at his own face on the poster. "Common enough name out here," he said carefully. "True enough." Hawthorne folded the poster away. "Thing is, I've been tracking this particular Jake Cordell for the better part of a year, and his trail went cold around these parts." "Hard to say. We get a lot of drifters." The Marshal nodded, his sharp eyes taking in details of the office. "You seem to run a tight operation. How long you been wearing the badge?" "About 8 months. Good work, is it? Law enforcement?" Jake considered the question, thinking about the satisfaction he'd found in protecting people instead of preying on them. "It suits me," he said finally. "Always wanted to be on the right side of justice. Noble calling." Hawthorne's smile seemed genuine. "Of course, it takes a certain kind of man to do the job right, someone who understands both sides, law and lawlessness, order and chaos." "I suppose it does." They sat in comfortable silence. Finally, Hawthorne spoke again. "Tell me, Deputy Cordell, what's your opinion on redemption? Man does wrong, tries to make amends. You think that's possible?" The question hit Jake like a physical blow. "I think people can change if they really want to. Question is whether society's willing to let them." "Interesting perspective." The Marshal leaned back, studying Jake with eyes that missed nothing. "Most lawmen see things in simpler terms. Good and evil, no middle ground. Maybe that's because most lawmen haven't had to wrestle with their own capacity for both." Hawthorne's eyebrows rose at this admission. "Honest answer. I appreciate honesty in a man." Sheriff Martinez chose that moment to return, entering with his usual competence. Jake made the introductions, grateful for the interruption but dreading what might come next. "Marshal Hawthorne's asking about Jake Cordell," Jake explained. "Ah, the infamous outlaw." Martinez settled behind his desk. "Had some bounty hunters through here a while back, asking the same questions." "And what did you tell them?" "Same thing, I'll tell you. We haven't seen hide nor hair of any bank robber matching that description." Martinez's tone was matter-of-fact. Hawthorne nodded slowly. "Nice town you got here, peaceful, law-abiding." "We like to think so." "Deputy Cordell seems like a good man, dedicated to his work." "One of the best I've worked with," Martinez said firmly. "Understands that law enforcement isn't just about catching criminals, it's about protecting innocent people." Hawthorne turned back to face them. "That's a mature understanding of the job. Not everyone comes to it naturally." Jake felt sweat beading on his forehead despite the cool air. Every word seemed loaded with double meaning. "Marshal," he said quietly, "what's your interest in Jake Cordell specifically?" Hawthorne was quiet for a long moment. "Good question. Truth is, I've been studying this case for months, and something about it doesn't sit right." "How so?" Martinez asked. "Pattern's wrong. Most bank robbers start small and work their way up. But this Jake Cordell went straight to banks with no prior criminal history." The Marshal paused. "Then there's the witnesses. Every description paints him as ruthless, violent, but in every robbery attributed to him, nobody actually got hurt. Jake's heart was pounding. Maybe he just got lucky. Maybe, or maybe the Jake Cordell everyone's looking for isn't the same man who committed those crimes. Hawthorne's eyes met Jake's directly. Maybe the real story is more complicated. The silence stretched like a wire about to snap. Jake could feel his future balanced on whatever came next. "Marshal," Martinez said finally, "what exactly are you suggesting?" "I'm suggesting that sometimes a man gets painted as a villain when he's really just a victim of circumstances." Hawthorne's voice was careful but not unkind. "I'm suggesting that if such a man had found a way to make amends, if he'd proven himself productive, well, sometimes justice is better served by allowing redemption than demanding retribution." Jake stared at the federal marshal, hardly daring to believe what he was hearing. "You're saying you'd be willing to overlook—" "I'm saying that Jake Cordell, the bank robber, seems to have vanished completely. No new crimes, no sightings, no trace." Hawthorne's smile was slight but definite. "Man like that, he's either dead or he's found a reason to change his ways. Either case, he's no longer a threat." "And the warrant?" "Warrants can be difficult to serve when the subject can't be located. Sometimes they just expire from lack of actionable leads." Jake felt his knees go weak with relief and gratitude. This federal marshal was offering him something he'd never dared hope for. Official absolution. "Why?" he asked quietly. "Because I've spent 30 years chasing bad men, and I've learned to recognize the difference between someone who's truly dangerous and someone who's just lost their way." Hawthorne replaced his hat and moved toward the door. "Jake Cordell, the outlaw, was a desperate man making desperate choices. Deputy Jake Cordell is a man who's found his way home." After the marshal left, Jake and Martinez sat in stunned silence. "Well, I'll be damned," Martinez said finally. "Federal marshal just officially looked the other way. Think he really meant it? Man doesn't become a U.S. Marshal without being able to judge character. If he says you're done with your outlaw days, I believe him." Jake walked home that evening with a lightness in his step he hadn't felt since before Samuel's death. The weight of his past, the constant fear of discovery, had been lifted by a lawman who understood that justice sometimes wore a different face than vengeance. He found Evangeline in their garden, tending the vegetables they'd planted together. She looked up at his approach, noting something different in his expression. "Good day," she asked. "The best in 3 years." Jake knelt beside her among the growing things. "Had a visitor today, federal marshal." Evangeline's hands stilled in the dirt. "Oh?" "Seems the warrant for Jake Cordell has been unofficially withdrawn due to lack of actionable evidence." Jake's voice was thick with emotion. He said the man they were looking for doesn't exist anymore. Tears sprang to Evangeline's eyes as she grasped what this meant. "You're free. We're free. To build whatever life we want without looking over our shoulders." Jake pulled her into his arms, holding her close among the plants she tended with such care. "Free to be the people we choose to be." They knelt there in the garden as the sun set over Cedar Ridge, two people who'd found in each other the possibility of redemption. Around them, the desert bloomed with life that shouldn't have been possible in such harsh ground, testament to the power of careful tending and patient faith. 1 year later, Jake stood on the church steps holding their newborn son while Evangeline recovered from the birth. The baby, Samuel Hayes Cordell, was small but healthy, with his father's dark hair and his mother's steady gaze. "Think he'll be proud of his name?" Jake asked softly. "I think your brother would be honored," Evangeline replied. "And proud of the man you've become." Sheriff Martinez approached from across the street, his weathered face creased in a smile. "Heard the good news. Congratulations." "Thank you." Jake shifted the baby carefully, still amazed by the trust required to hold something so precious. "Got some news of my own," Martinez continued. "Territory's offering me a promotion. Chief Marshal for the entire district. Means Cedar Ridge needs a new sheriff. His smile broadened. Job's yours if you want it, Sheriff Cordell. The title sent a thrill through Jake that had nothing to do with ambition and everything to do with belonging. From wanted outlaw to sheriff, it was a transformation that would have seemed impossible 2 years ago. I accept, he said without hesitation. That evening, as they sat on their porch watching the stars emerge, Jake reflected on the journey that had brought him to this moment. Samuel Hayes Cordell slept peacefully in his arms while Evangeline dozed against his shoulder. The man who'd ridden into Cedar Ridge with robbery on his mind no longer existed. In his place sat Sheriff Jake Cordell, husband to the preacher's daughter, father to a son named for a brother who'd believed in justice, protector of a community that had accepted him despite his past. If this story has touched your heart, I hope you found inspiration in the possibility of redemption and second chances. Remember that our stories here on the channel are fictional, created to inspire and entertain, and are never meant to offend anyone. If you've enjoyed Jake and Evangeline's journey, please subscribe to the channel, like this video, comment with your thoughts, and share it with friends who love tales of love and redemption from the Old West. Thank you for watching, and remember, it's never too late to choose who you want to become. Jake looked down at his sleeping son, then out at the town he'd sworn to protect, and felt the deep satisfaction of a man who'd found his way home. Love had saved him, faith had redeemed him, and now he had the chance to spend the rest of his life proving worthy of both gifts. In the distance, a coyote called to the moon, its voice carrying across the desert night like a hymn of survival and hope. Jake Cordell, sheriff of Cedar Ridge, listened to that wild song and smiled, knowing that some endings were really just new beginnings in disguise.